Sooner or later, everybody's involved as part of a team, and teams don't just happen, you have to work at it. And we've got three great guys here who've all had different wonderful experiences in building teams and working with teams. I'd like to start with Andy. Sure. You wrote the book, Pushing Back Entropy, yes. Moving Teams from Conflict to Health. So first of all, what was behind that? Why did you decide that was the book you wanted to write?
Well, I think that the whole word entropy is where I started. And my experiences have been that every time you work with teams, or it really can be a team of two, i.e. a couple, if you don't push things in the right direction, they sort of inevitably go the wrong direction. And so I was really desiring to have a handbook that I could use with clients that would walk them through not only how to avoid conflict, but how to build health in that relationship that a team needs to have.
So the idea is that a team doesn't just happen. It's not
No, it's not automatic. In fact, doing nothing guarantees that we sort of go in the wrong direction.
Yeah. And for a lot of teams, I think whether it's a sports team or a business team or an artistic team, one of the things they have to deal with a lot is conflict. It's like, that bumper sticker about something happens. It's like conflict happens.
That's right.
And so why did you devote the first half of the book to the topic of conflict?
Well, that was a bit personal. For me, lots of life had dealt me those conflict cards, and so tried to react to that over many years, researching conflict and all the various theories of conflict mediation, and really felt that there was still room within that field for new thoughts. And so again, I think the first half of Entropy gets really into a new theory of conflict that helps people deal at a deeper level.
And what I appreciated about it is I know that you have a master's in counseling, and so you have a pretty good understanding of the body of information around conflict as a psychologist.
Yep.
And you wanted to bring that into a practical application for especially organizations that are building teams.
Right, in the workplace. And what I end up doing a lot with clients in a workplace setting, sometimes I actually call it this, and it's really like couples counseling at work. So you work with your work spouse, and a lot of times I'm the third party helping to resolve those kind of conflicts. And I found that really moves the culture of the organization forward quite quickly and quite dramatically.
Yeah. And so one of the things that you've been able to do that was exciting, and we probably can't actually name the team because they don't want to give away their secrets, but you worked with a professional sports team.
Yeah, the Bruins.
Oh, we can talk.
Sure, why not?
And they won the Stanley Cup year that you worked with them.
They did.
And what did you discover working with them about building effective teams?
You know, as I think about athletic teams, and particularly that team, what I noticed, we got to work with them the first 2 days of training camp. And the relationships that they had built while being on the ice with the coach, really away from management, were quite unique. There was a lot of pushing and shoving and jostling and joking, and you could tell they had a real sense of trust amongst themselves, because when you go through 62 games a year and you're on the ice and you're beating each other up in practice and in games and you're traveling on a bus, there's a lot of conflict involved in that and a lot of rough stuff. And they had great respect for their expertise. They had great respect for the what they brought with them to the team, the years of hockey that they'd played, and they had great respect for the coach and the leader. So what I noticed when he spoke, they really listened and they appreciated his knowledge and his way of pulling that team together. One of the aspects of that time that we had together was we were out in the woods and we were doing some climbing in trees and watching how people reacted under stress. And believe it or not, some of the guys that would go in a corner had trouble with heights. But we got them talking, and we got them talking to the coaches. And for the first time, what we understood after we were done was as they spoke to the coaches for the first time about their experience in the woods, they started saying to the coach, you were encouraging me up that tree. When I'm out on the ice, I get off and all you do is yell at me. Oh. And it was the first time they were able to say, it would be better if you did more of what we do out in the woods encouraging than it would be when we get off the ice. And sure enough, they practiced that throughout the year. And I had the great fortune of working with them the year they won the Stanley Cup. I don't take credit for it, but we certainly got off to a good start.
Yeah, that's great. So Renji, your experience has been as a leader of teams in a different kind of environment because you've been involved a lot in global businesses where you had teams that were spread around the world. Did conflict show up with those dispersed teams the same way that it does when we're playing 62 games on the ice together, or did conflict take a different shape?
I think both Whit and Andy both mentioned conflict. Conflict always happens when you have a group of people together. Because what happens when you have a group of individuals who come together, who think differently, who act differently, whose experiences are different, whose upbringing is different, whose world views are different, their awareness of self is at different levels, invariably some conflict occurs. Someone may have a great idea, others might think that's a lousy idea. So it is something that occurs whether you're in this country or another country or on a global basis, or even when you're working on a virtual basis. Conflict is always going to be there.
So you can't build a strong team with the idea that you're going to avoid conflict.
That's right.
You have to build a strong team figuring out a way that you're going to deal with conflict, that
Yeah,
you're going to manage.
you have to tackle it head on.
Yeah.
And it's about, I think we talked about conversation and dialogue. It's about how do you get the individuals to have that conversation, have that dialogue. How do they listen to one another? How do they ask the right questions of one another? You know, in that conversation, invariably, someone will identify another person on that team that thinks like them and may gravitate towards that individual. They may also identify people on that team that are completely different from them. And I think my learning over the last 20 years is that we should gravitate towards the people who are unlike us. So we start building the relationships with that individual, learning how to communicate well with someone who's different than you, who thinks differently than you, particularly those who oppose your views. How do you have the right dialogue with them?
So one of the things that strikes me listening to you say that is this phrase, "you complete me," that in a certain sense, for a team to reach that magic level, there has to be that I learned something from you that has made me complete or made me different. Yeah.
Right. And I think, Renji, that connects beautifully with, I think the heart of the conflict model and entropy is this idea that what essentially happens is a failure to value the difference. A lot of times when I throw the question out to people and say, what's causing conflicts? The number one answer I hear to that question is we're different, and I always call foul on that. That's not the reason. The differences are something that are a good thing that we should celebrate. What's happening generally in a conflict is I'm failing to value you because you're different.
Right. I just to carry that thought forward, Andy, everybody is different, right? Everybody brings something to the table.
Absolutely.
And there's everywhere in life you will find someone who does something much better than you in at least one or two things.
Right.
So honoring that, recognizing that, and embracing that, I think is the first start.
And we all have spouses, so we learned right there that everybody's different.
Right.
That if you're dependent on a team all being the same, that you're not ever going to get there, and you're probably not going to be a very good team if everybody has
Right.
the same role to play.
Right. It's boring.
Yeah, so one of the things that you've done as part of your developing teams is you were a crew coach for a number of years. You were the varsity coach at the University of New Hampshire for 4 years.
Yes.
Then you coached at the Coast Guard and
US
at
Coast Guard.
Dartmouth.
Yep.
And there you're talking about you're putting a bunch of people in a boat, and were they all equals, or did they play different roles?
Or like any sport, there are different roles in a shell. So the people in the middle of the boat, you're looking for the great big strong guys to get the oar in the water and get it out of the water and pull as hard as they can. The guys in the stern of the boat are looking at the coxswain who's steering, who has a very different job. It's like being on a jockey on a horse. And those two guys, everybody's following them, so they're lean and mean, and they have a good stroke. And the guys up in the bow are usually a little smaller, and because anytime there's tipping, they're skilled up in the bow and the stern. But in the middle of the boat, it's called the engine room. And so there are different roles within a boat, and there are different sides. The oars are on different sides, so you kind of have to create this team that works in sync, so to speak, down the river.
Yeah, and at some point you decided that you wanted to take your coaching skills outside of the sports arena and bring them into the business arena. What was it that motivated that choice?
Well, I did some outdoor experiential work as we did with the Bruins many, many years ago, and we had a great client, United Airlines, and they wanted their top 300 people to get leadership training because they were going to own the company. So ESOP came along, and we spent 2 or 3 years working with the top 300, and then it expanded out to the top 1,500. So we did some outdoor experiential work to give them some opportunity to learn how to coach people, again, outdoors, up a tree. This was in the 80s. And what I learned, because I never went to business school and I never worked in a business, but what I learned was the leaders would come to me and say, so I watched how this team put this puzzle together, or I watched them climb. What can I learn from watching that and observing that I can take back to the workplace? So a lot of my trainings early on was, so what did you do out here in the woods where you were having some fun, but what did you see out here that you see back at work? And there's a pause for everybody, and they think, you know what? Joe tells us out here what to do. He tells us what to do back at work. Carrie's very encouraging and helped us get up the tree, and she's like that back at work. So we were trying to take the experiences from outside and transfer them inside, and then make action plans for, okay, what do we need to do to get 10% better?
Yeah. So Andy, you had mentioned earlier that differences are part of what makes a great team.
Right.
And that it's not really an excuse for conflict. Instead of it's an opportunity for us to grow and discover from each other.
Absolutely.
And so I know that part of the way that you define differences is you look at a person's behavioral style. And
Right.
you look at their motivators, what it is that drives their behaviors. And then you look at their emotional intelligence. So tell us a little bit about the behavioral style part. How do you help a team understand the differences in each other behaviorally?
Right. So behavioral style is kind of, insider language. So to explain to others that are listening, it's kind of like temperament. And what it's really describing is the way that people tend to behave that we can observe outwardly. So I can see, for instance, between the four of us, the three of you are much more extroverted than I am. I'm more introverted. And so that's relevant to think about the pace with which I want to maybe think about things, or even the pace with which I discuss things. And we need to move at different paces and value, and again, respect those differences to work together as a team. So that's one aspect of those differences.
And I'll let you carry on in a moment, but one of the things I really
Absolutely.
appreciated about a meeting that we were in last night is
Yeah.
at the end of the meeting,
Right.
you said, us introverts, we've
That's
been
right.
overwhelmed with everything happening here, and we need time to process it.
That's correct.
And I knew that means that in 3 days or 4 days or a week,
Right.
that I'm going to hear from you and you're going to have some terrific insights.
Yeah.
But you needed time to process those.
Right.
As
Right.
compared to, you said the three of us are extroverts. Are
Yeah.
you saying that we like to put our mouth in front of our brain? Is that?
Well, I'll let you guys answer that. Well, the reality is, again, in the West, the culture sort of favors that side of the equation. And really what I think we need isn't to flip the scales the other way, it's to value both sides and balance.
Yeah.
And so again, it's these things that we're talking about. And so part of my mission in life, especially as I work with teams, is helping the extroverts around the table understand introversion. What is it and what it's not, so that they can better value those on the team and get their feedback.
Yeah, so you're talking about that in the context of behavioral differences.
Right.
And you said it's introvert versus extrovert. What are the other ways that you identify behavioral
So we look
differences?
at lots of different dimensions of people, but the one that you mentioned a moment ago, motivators, gets at a deeper level. What's making somebody tick? What's driving them or not driving them? And so what we find, just as in behaviors, at the motivational level, people are really motivated quite differently. And what I have experienced is that lots of conflict, we were talking about conflict a moment ago, lots of conflict, in fact, is driven more deeply at the motivator level than at behaviors. So we're more passionate about what we believe in and what we think is important, and that can also be a way that we can get sideways with each other.
Yeah. So Renji, you've taught MBA programs. What role does this understanding differences play for somebody who's, say, going through an MBA program and they're getting ready to take a more substantial leadership role? Is it important for them to learn the kinds of things that Andy's talking about, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to ask my students, how many of you are satisfied in your job? And invariably, only one or two hands go up.
This is an MBA class.
This is an MBA class. You would think that business students are pretty well in tune with business and who they are as individuals and how they contribute to that business. But it's surprising that more people are not only have some opportunities to learn more about themselves, enhance their self-awareness skills, but what their role is in the company is sometimes questioned. And I think so the learning for me is that Andy talked about motivators and behaviors. The more we understand how we behave, and more importantly, how we behave under stress, when we're making decisions, when we're under pressure, do our behaviors change? That's important for us to know that. But more importantly, it's important for someone else to recognize that so they change their communication styles, adapt to that. From a motivator's perspective, it's important for someone to understand what drives them, why they do what they do. Because sometimes they find that they're not in the right job. because their motivators are different. So if someone who's really motivated by aesthetics, in other words, the beauty and harmony of things, and that person's in a sales job, and they have a low utilitarian score, or they have less appreciation for a return, then they should not be in a sales job.
Yeah.
They might be in more of a marketing job. So sometimes there's a fine line between people who are in sales jobs versus marketing jobs. It isn't like sales and marketing are the same. They're very different.
Yeah, so the idea of understanding differences in team members is not just about getting along, it's about performing also. It's about getting the results that you're looking for.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the team doesn't get together just to hang out like the four of us are hanging out
Yeah.
here.
Yes.
They get together for a purpose. The
Yeah.
team always has a purpose, an end game. And that end game can only be manifested as quickly and with the highest level of results if the team works in sync.
So Whit, I know that not only have you worked with United Airlines, but you've worked with a lot of well-known public large companies. I'm thinking of one in particular that you've had several projects with. And I don't have permission to mention their name, so I won't, but you know who I'm talking about. And you've worked with a lot of different teams inside that company. Tell me a little bit about how you help that team to understand these differences, not just to get along better, but to increase their performance, and what results do you get?
Yeah. So we use some psychometrics, we all use those, to help people understand their behaviors, what motivates them, their acumen index, and their leadership competencies. And the two that really I get the most traction from on teams, because they're very practical, easy to understand, and the leaders of the teams use them in hiring and developing their people. So within the teams that I've worked in, the first thing that I want to make sure happens is an increase in self-awareness. So the leading cause of death of an executive career is lack of self-awareness. Great quote from Sam Kinney, #1 in his class at Tuck School. My job is to go in there and really help them to open up the window so that they can see more about themselves and the impact they have on others as much as the people around them see. And once they have that aha, the next job is to help them understand how to work more effectively with their team members, and then for the leader to be able to understand, okay, I've got all this information in front of me, let's put it on one page and help me understand how I can best coach each of these people.
Yeah.
We've had great results with that.
Yeah, so this is the tools that we're all using come from TTI Success Insights,
Yes.
which is a company that's been in business for over 30 years, and it's been pretty important for the work that we all do in building teams. So you're taking the results or the graphs from one of TTI Success Insights reports, and they're actually putting it on their door,
Yes.
on their office door,
Yes.
so that when you walk in, it reminds you of who the person is that you're going to work with. Okay, so they get along better. Do they perform better?
So we did some work with 5 different areas, and we measured in March and we measured again in November, 9 months later. What we discovered was that communication, so the question was on a scale of 1 to 10, how's communication amongst this team? 1 to 10, 5.5. At the end of it, 8.9. Morale, trust, stress, all the numbers changed dramatically over 9 months.
In a positive
In
direction.
a positive direction, and they went from number 38 in sales to number 2 in sales.
Okay, that's
within
what
the
I wanted to
organization.
hear. Did it have a financial
Yeah,
impact?
Good for you. Good for you.
They went from what in sales?
Number 38 to number 2.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's
9 months.
fantastic. Yeah, that's
And
great.
the leader attributes it to, or the team attributes it to the leader being more open, opening his door, listening more, and so they started communicating more effectively, and the team really started to gel, and they got excited, and I heard words like fun and family and engaged and results, and so it was a fabulous project.
Yeah, so I love that these talent profiles become a sort of a springboard to understanding each other, figuring out how to organize a little bit better. One of our associates, Skip Hall, who was an NCAA football coach for 30 years, I was talking with Skip one day, and I said, Skip, how much, when you were coaching, how much did your players practice each week? And of course, Skip said, well, the NCAA rules have changed today from when I was coaching, but he said today the NCAA rules are they can only practice 20 hours per week with a coach. Now they can go into the gym and lift and things without a coach present, but to work with a coach, it's only 20 hours per week. So I thought, okay, the typical college team today has 50, 60, some of them maybe 100 players, times 20 hours each per week. That's a lot of hours. And I said, wow, Skip, that's a lot of practicing for a 3-hour game on the weekend. And Skip said, well, you're actually wrong, Ron. It's not a 3-hour game. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, if you actually time the amount of time that they're actually executing inside the game, so they're not standing in the huddle, it's not a timeout, it's not halftime, but they're actually in the middle of a play,
Performing.
it's between 11 to 12 minutes a week. So he said 20 hours a week of practice for all these players for 11 to 12 minutes of performance. And you know where my mind went? Right away I thought, well now, how do business teams practice? And do they put in the amount of practice that's necessary to perform at the optimal level? And so it brings me back to your book, Andy, because one of the things that you talk about in the second half of your book is here are some ways you practice. Here's some different principles to think about so that you build that team morale,
Right.
that team spirit. So tell
Right.
us what those are.
Yeah, so I think what's helpful, lots of teams, I think, suffer from lack of a model. So in Entropy, I lay out a 5-component model. They're all C's, so it's easy to remember. And it really begins with a foundation of character. And in that character, the way I define it is that character is comprised of not only sort of doing the right things or being ethical, but also kind of getting back to Whit's point, emotional intelligence, self-awareness really being the chief skill that leads in that area. So teams first have character, and then in the heart of the model, I get into a discussion around cohesiveness, which really, again, you were talking to that a moment ago, with the bonding and the connectedness that we feel with one another, all the soft stuff. I get teased a lot because I spend a lot of time as a former therapist talking about soft stuff. But what I find is that soft stuff leads to hard stuff.
Yeah.
And so it does matter. So cohesion for the team is critical for the model. And then we've been talking about it, throughout this discussion. Clarity is also in the heart of that model. That's the third C. So who am I? Am I somebody that's in the engine room in the boat, or am I the coxswain? And what happens if I get the wrong person in the wrong role? Disaster ensues. And then fourthly, which again, though there's been lots of books written and lots of talk about it, communication, I would think you'd agree, right? With
Yes.
Communication still pops up as the number one thing that isn't working. Yeah. It's amazing how many books exist, and yet we still struggle. Yeah. So that's the fourth piece of the model. In the book, I lay out a 10-point strategic plan that organizations that I work with use to improve communication, which really is at the heart of improving their team health and the bottom line results. The capstone piece of the model is what I call positive consequences. Consequences is the fifth C. And what I describe in the book is that working on the soft stuff or the intrinsic stuff leads to extrinsic results or success. And so that all of those things that Whit was talking about a moment ago really add up to a tremendous bottom line improvement. And you and I have been working with a client, we won't say who it is, but we've seen the bottom line move. And really what I've been doing for months is I've sort of embedded myself in the culture of the company and been doing lots of things. Frankly, they look like group therapy sometimes or couples counseling. But what I'm finding is that when those relationships improve between people, the bottom line starts moving up. So again, it's all connected. Yeah. And so that's the model that you're talking about.
Yeah, and what I hear in your model, which I think is brilliant, is that it's this sort of ecosystem between relationships and results.
Absolutely.
The relationships need to be healthy, but they're healthy to create a result.
Right.
And if you overemphasize the results, the relationships deteriorate. And if you overemphasize the relationships, it becomes a community meeting,
right?
Instead of a business
and
or an organization.
I would say there's feedback loops going both directions between those two components.
Yeah.
And does it change if the person is a millennial or someone who's young? Their communication styles are different.
Yeah.
And they're motivated by different things.
Right.
They've grown up in an era of technology or the mobile devices. Does that change? I'm sure communication is still important.
Yeah.
How does the younger generation enhance their communication skills?
I would say, Renji, that communication is critical, but the means by which we communicate with each other, I think you'd agree. You talk about a lot in potluck culture. The means of communication has changed dramatically. So whereas we used to have much more formal means of communication, things that I think are becoming passé, like performance reviews that you talk extensively about, I think now it's moving to much different ways of getting feedback, things like Tiny Pulse, where we're getting immediate feedback over text messages, or we're telling the CEO, we've been using that with some companies that we work with, where the CEO is sending out questions every week and getting constant feedback. So I think, again, with the younger generation, we'll call them millennials, though they don't like to be called that. But in any case, I think they are much more desirous, I think, than even the generation before them of seeing these softer skills develop in the workplace. For them, I think it's really all about meaning. And so meaning and having meaningful relationships and meaningful work, I think the wheel on which that rolls is communication. So that's how
Well, I
would
love
say
this
it.
conversation about teams because there's always a new challenge, a new opportunity. Matter of fact, the Bruins didn't win the Stanley Cup the next year.
They did not.
But what I think of as one of the highlights that I hope we all get the chance to do someday is to stand next to our equivalent of the Stanley Cup like this guy got to.
Yeah.
So that's our conversation about effective teams.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks.